Cheow Hoe, in our discussion to date, we've been focusing on what you've been doing within Gov Tech and how Gov Tech coordinates with the rest of the Singapore government, and through that, with the population of Singapore. Let's change tracks a bit and talk about how Gov Tech communicates with, learns from the international community. What are some of the regular ways and then ad hoc ways in which you have interactions with other countries and other entities that are part of the international community?
You know, we realized very early on that we're not alone in this journey, and that, you know, many countries are going through some of the same struggles that we went through. And that's one very good thing about government versus the private sector, is that we're not competitors. We don't take revenue from each other. So people are quite willing to share and learn from each other. So we started making friends with people, right, with different countries. And I think the starting point was something quite interesting. We decided in about 2015, which is quite some time back, 7 years ago or so, to pull together a group of like-minded countries to come together every year to share on topics that are of interest to us.
Like-minded in what way, since there are obviously many dimensions along which could be like-minded? Is this smart nation and digital government like-minded or something else?
Okay. I think if you look around the world, there's a bunch of countries that's really at the forefront of digital government. And we kind of look at them and say they are probably closest to us in terms of the problems and the things that they're encountering. And we brought together something like about 14, 15 countries, like many of the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, etc., UK, Korea, China, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, the Netherlands, the US. So these countries, I find, were in many ways encountering very much the same challenges that we were. They have came up with very good solutions to face some of these challenges. So I kind of approached people that were my peers, so the government CIO, the government chief technology officer of these countries, pulled them together for a conference, and we call it DGX, Digital Government Exchange.
Okay.
We started in 2015, if I'm not wrong. And since then, we have held it every year, physically until the last 2 years because of pandemic, virtually. And we became friends, which I think is quite amazing, right? Many of us became friends. We have a chat group together. If there's any problems, we kind of like talk to each other, learn from each other. And I think that's really the value of that international community exchange.
You know, the examples you gave of some of the countries that are part of DGX, Digital Government Exchange, some are small states, there's some even smaller than Singapore, believe it or not. Some are medium-sized, some are very large. So it's a spectrum of countries, but you say they're all relatively sophisticated in their approach to digital government.
Right. And I think more importantly is that they are also facing quite similar problems to us.
Yes.
So there is kind of a meeting of minds in many of these things. And one of the things we also did as we went on was that beyond a once-in-a-year meeting, we also set up working groups of common topics that we come together on. So for example, there was a topic on cloud, because everybody was thinking about going to commercial cloud. How do we share the experiences of what going to the cloud is like? What are the policy responses? What are the technical challenges? Things like that. We had a track on, for example, digital maturity. All of us are going through thinking about how do we improve the maturity of each of our agencies,
so you would then compare how each of these countries is doing their own maturity index and the ins and outs of their approach. Yes.
And then we have a track on national digital identity, because more and more countries are thinking about that, what are the challenges, etc. And these are really invaluable because you're learning from each other, real stuff, practical stuff, not just high-level conceptual things.
Can you just give some examples of where Singapore has learned by seeing what other people are doing through the Digital Government Exchange?
You know, interestingly, the first country that I think we learned a lot from in the very beginning, about 2014, was the UK. UK started GDS, the Government Digital Service, before us, probably like in 2012 or 2011. And they started building capabilities, just like what we did. And I think we learned a lot from that whole experience. I think it's been a tremendous experience. We learned a lot from that itself. And it doesn't stop there, right? We are still very much involved with UK right now. We have an MOU with them. I sit on the advisory board for GDS. So these are really some of the really, relationship that we've built over the years. And I think it's really, really powerful.
Now, from what you said, digital government exchange are highly developed countries in terms of the state of their economies, and they've been putting substantial resources relative to their economy into digital government. In some ways, these are amongst the most sophisticated examples on the planet.
Right.
Now, what about other countries? Are there ways in which other countries can peek into or get some visibility from the collective learning of the DGX team?
Yeah, so the way we do that is then to work with the international agencies, UN, World Bank, the EU, WEF, etc. The reason why we work with them quite closely too is that they serve a much larger community of countries. So we have done so many keynotes as well as workshops through the UN platform or through the World Bank platform, engaging all different countries. We even hosted in Singapore a collection of small island states based on the UN platform, whereby we shared a lot with a lot of small island states in terms of digital development. In fact, after this in the afternoon, I'm doing a call with Indonesia, whereby I did a keynote just about a month ago through the World Bank platform, for example. So I did one for Vietnam, and we do a lot of these things. And the reason is that we think that it's really our role also to help as many countries as we can in this whole process. And in helping, we also learn from them.
It's time intensive, of course, to have these group-on-group or one-on-one meetings with a different country, and it would be impossible to respond to every request.
Right.
So what I'm wondering was, when we were talking about codecs, for example, in your tech stack, you talked about portals that you have that actually make it easier for participants to go and self-learn or see what's there. In terms of other governments wanting to learn from Singapore, of course, they'll love to talk to you. That's why we're doing these videos, right? But are there information sources they can go to and do their own homework?
Yeah, I think the websites that we have for Gov Tech is pretty good. But another very important portal, for lack of a better word, is a developers portal. The developers portal gives very detailed information of all the products that we have.
This is Gov Tech's developers portal.
Yes,
right.
Correct.
And is it public access?
Yes, it's public access. There are certain parts which needs a password, and it's basically over time we are trying to share many of these things also.
Right.
We even share source codes. We open source many of these things. We are also in the process of looking at the API marketplace, for example, to share many of these things. So this is another big part which I think my team is focusing quite a fair bit on.
So what you're saying is, for governments that are seriously interested, if they ask the appropriate people within their staff to go look within the GovTech website at the developers portal, it's not the policy type of information, but it's the real assets.
The real assets, yes.
And from that, you can figure out sort of what the policies are, because you're seeing what people are actually doing.
Right.
And then also on the GovTech website, you make available the products and services, both for citizens and residents, for business, as well as for other parts of government and for industry.
That's correct.
All right. So there's a lot of self-learning people
There's a
can
lot of
do.
assets out there, a lot of content and assets out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any new initiatives on the horizon for international groups in the area of digital government, e-government, smart nation? Are there
There are always a lot of different international groupings. The Global Government Forum is one of them. There are many of them, actually. We do participate in quite a few of them. And this is just part and parcel of the international work that my team does.
Okay. I'd like to specifically probe you about your interactions, when I say you, I mean all of GovTech, with developing countries. Can you give some examples of special efforts you make to address requests from developing countries? And, there must be a portfolio of such examples.
Yeah, I think our work with the United Nations and World Bank has been very fruitful. They are the ones that kind of connects us to the relevant developing countries that needs help. And if we can, we normally try to help, right? And as I said, we are also reaching out to a lot of ASEAN countries, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Malaysia, etc. Those work are ongoing. And in fact, as I said, this afternoon I'm talking to Indonesia. The World Bank has really been very, very helpful in this because they are also funding many of these nations. And one way is to really get the meeting of minds in terms of what they need to do going forward. And we've been very helpful to them to make sure this happens. The United Nations is interesting. I mean, that's why this video is being done in the first place, to really address the needs of many of the developing countries that really want to digitalize. So the effort is quite a lot. I mean, it's not non-trivial to keep doing all these things, but we think that it's worth doing it, basically.
Well, we think it's worth doing. And of course, there's the altruistic aspect. We want to help the world. But why do we think it's worth doing?
As I said, I think we always do learn something new from engaging a country. It's not a matter of whether the country is more developed or less developed, because we learn about use cases, we learn about some of the challenges they have, and these learnings are quite invaluable. When we deal with a fast developing country, in many ways they have an advantage. You know why? Because the years of things that we have done, the legacies that we have navigated, they could actually leapfrog.
Well, they don't have the legacy.
They don't have the legacy sometimes. They can go directly to the cloud, for example. They can go directly to many of the things that are out there, which could, in a sense, circumvent many of the challenges that we had in the past, provided the policy direction allows them to do it.
Yes.
So sometimes it really makes me think, when I first spoke to Estonia many years ago, to their CTO, his name was Tavi. Tavi said something to me that was quite interesting, which is that we actually learned from Singapore quite a fair bit in the beginning. And then we realized one thing. We could do things faster because we were even smaller than Singapore. And we did not have some of the legacies. And we could actually leapfrog.
Right. And Singapore's not even an old country, but
Exactly.
still we had the legacies.
Right. So in many ways, I don't see as developed versus developing countries. If the developing countries get their act together and do it right, actually they have a great chance to really move steps ahead.
Yes.
Without necessarily having to go through the first couple of steps of painful
Let me come
evolution.
back, because we're all familiar, we've heard over the years, not just with digital government, but many aspects of life, the phrase, the ability to leapfrog.
Yeah.
And with technology and the progression of developing countries, there's this popular term, leapfrog. It's a deceptive concept because, as you have said, no matter what, there's just a lot of step-by-step capability development that has to go into building the capacity for digital government. Certain aspects of learning cannot be leapfrogged. You've
Yep.
got to go
Of
through
course,
the
of
steps.
course.
But certain constraints can be leapfrogged.
Of course.
Let's talk about this issue of leapfrog because it's a commonly used term, but it's a deceptive term. On one hand, certain aspects of learning cannot be leapfrogged. You've got to start at the beginning and within a country build step by step the capability for digital government. But certain kinds of things can be leapfrogged. So let's look at this issue of leapfrog with a little bit more precision. And your suggestion that countries who are on a development progression of getting started with digital government now, what do we realistically mean when we say they can leapfrog?
You know, over the last probably 7, 8 years or so, technology has moved dramatically. You know, for example, we keep talking about the use of the cloud and the tech stack. That has changed so much in the last 7, 8 years. If I were to do it again all over, I would go directly to this and not even bother about doing many of the things we've done before. But that is going to be constrained by one thing, the policy dimension. Can these countries unpack the policy dimensions to allow technology to be used, the right technology to be used today versus 7 years ago, 8 years ago? So this is going to be a very important part for countries to think through and say that, well, you know, I don't have to go through that 7, 8 years of development, but if I can just unpack my policy to allow certain use of the newest technology today, they can actually move quite fast.
Right.
Because the reality is that technology over the last 7, 8 years has moved dramatically.
Right. So in a way, the leapfrogging is they don't have to deal with some of the legacy constraints that countries who've been doing these for decades have already in place.
Yeah.
But they cannot leapfrog the fact that you have to start someplace, gain experience every day, and move forward.
Of course, of course.
Yes.
Of course.
All right. Well, okay. Do you have any other suggestions for countries who are in earlier stages of digital government evolution?
You know, it goes back to the same thing, right? You know, when I did a couple of these sessions, some of the countries, the more developing countries asked me, he said, how do we even start, right? Because we may not have the budget, we may not have the capabilities, we may not have the technology in the beginning. So how do we start? And it always goes back to something that I said in the very beginning. Start small. You know, this whole journey can be very infectious. You need to start something small, show that it can be done, and then all of a sudden things opens up. So it's like us, right? We started with 7, 8 people. We were doing very simple things in the beginning, but it was effective. Huh?
Right. Well, you know, there's another implied aspect based on our conversations. One is start small, and the other one is no starting point is too humble.
Yes.
In the sense that don't try and focus on fancy things. Focus on the most basic things that people need to do.
Things, right?
Yes.
You know, you can't cure cancer tomorrow, right? But the thing is that you need to start somewhere.
Well, you can make it easier to register a birth.
Right.
You can make it easier to register a death. Right.
And it all comes back to the most fundamental underpinning of digital technology. Know what problem you're trying to solve. It's not about technology, it's about knowing the problem you're trying to solve. And once you know the problem you're trying to solve, then everything falls into place.
But that takes some discipline, Cheow Hoe,
of course,
because the reality is so many people get distracted by the new shiny object.
Oh, of course.
So many people get distracted that, oh, we need to be using more AI. We need to be using IoT. We need to be using this or that new technology. And what you're saying is these are enablers in the way that they can enable certain things, But the fundamental is the problem targeting.
And you know, in the government, we are not an R&D organization. So most of the time, it's very dangerous to use what we call bleeding edge technology. Well, what's the point? I think for us, what's more important is to use proven, established technology in an innovative way. That's how we should do it. I mean, I'll give you an example, right? If you look at Apple, look at the Apple phone. Is it very innovative? From a design point of view, it is. But are they using the latest, greatest technology in the Apple phone? Not necessary. Most of it are proven technology. And in fact, Apple prefers proven technology than the latest ones, right? Do they have a blood pressure monitor in the phone? No. Why? Because it's not proven yet. Do they have a blood sugar monitoring in the phone? No. Or the watch? No. It's not ready yet. But they built the phone really well to do the things it's supposed to do. And that's how the government should look at it.
Yes, and then evolve over time.
Exactly.
And as you mentioned, once you have these foundation capabilities, both in terms of policy making, administration, and the tech stack, you build on it.
Exactly. And you keep building on it, right? It's hard sometimes because a lot of education has to go through. Leaders need to understand that it's not just about reading about the latest technology. It's about letting the tech people figure out what's the best technology to solve a problem.
Right. And you've got to give them the experience to do it.
Exactly.
Yes. But that means you have to allow for some failure.
Of course.
You have to allow for some things that won't work the way you originally thought.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And you know, we kind of like support that culture a lot of innovation. Within Singapore itself, we have this thing called a white space funding, whereby anybody can come to us with a good idea. We normally give them a small amount to start with. We control two things, right? Time and money. We'll probably give them $50,000 in 3 months. Show me something that works in 3 months,
Right.
not more than that. Because if you can't, that means your idea probably is not going to work.
By white space, I think you're referring to empty space. It's not the name of the color per se, but government will have all these well-defined initiatives and all these programs where there's already established funding mechanisms. And it's for something that just doesn't fall into any of those already identified buckets.
And it's a very nascent idea. It's not something that's really formed yet. So they come to us, we give them a small amount of money to start with, give them 3 months, come back, show me a very rough prototype. If it works, we will fund them some more. We give them probably another 6 months, maybe now $100,000, build me a real prototype.
So that's very different from let's try a $5 billion experiment.
Exactly.
Yes.
And even if 50-60% of them fail, so what? It's not a lot of money. Because if you put $10 million in something and that fails, that's huge.
Yes.
Right?
Well, even if they fail at that few months and a few $1,000s or $50,000, the experience cycles
It's tremendous.
are probably very valuable.
Correct. And hopefully, you know, in this whole pipeline, some projects make it to real development, a prototype, a pilot, and subsequently even the major deployment, which has happened before.
Cheow Hoe, I'd like for you to further elaborate on your interactions with the tech community, how you build the ecosystem, how you sort of motivate two-way learning and two-way adoption.
You know, I was doing a presentation before and somebody asked me a question. Which country do I learn from? Which government do I learn from most of the time? And I told them, I said, look, why must I learn from government? I learn from everyone, right? In fact, actually the best people to learn from may not be from the government. It could be in the tech industry whereby, because they are just years, leaps and bounds ahead of most governments. From a Google, from a Facebook, from a Salesforce, we learn a lot from them. They are a very important part of the community. And the reason why we came out with this concept of having a developers conference is for us to engage thousands of developers out there who can actually help us. So we came up with Stack in 2018, whereby there were more than 3,000 developers joining us in a physical event.
So explain what Stack is.
Stack is really a developers conference whereby we showcase our products. We also get many of our partners to showcase their products.
Partners here being
Tech
private
companies,
sector
yeah.
industry who's done work with the government.
Correct.
Yes.
And it's our ability to go out there and show that what we're doing, get people to embrace it, get people to contribute to making the product better. And I think that's very important.
Well, tech enthusiasts would know that prominent tech companies have their own development conferences.
Of course.
A Microsoft, an Apple, a Google, a
Yeah,
Salesforce.
exactly.
So where does this idea come from that as a government, we have our own ecosystem building tech conference? That is a different idea.
It came from the fact that we learned from the tech companies, right? And we could only do this because we ourselves are very much like a tech company. Because we develop products. Unless you develop products, unless you have engineering capabilities, you can't have a developers conference.
Talk a little bit about what it takes to mount a developers conference. What are some of the key administrative or management issues? You don't just show up one day and thousands of people are participating. You had to somehow build and create this.
Credit to the team, actually. We have created a very strong community of developers who keep learning from us and contributing ideas.
And these are external people.
External people. They are people, from companies, private individuals. We have a meetup, 1 or 2 meetups every month, whereby we got a couple hundred people participating on very specific topics.
What are the names of these meetups?
We call them Stackx meetup.
Stackx.
Stack was the name that we kind of used as a common branding for all these things.
Okay. And meetup, just like in...
like any other tech meetup, you get 100 people sit down and we share a topic.
Right, and quite informal.
Very informal.
Right.
We share topics. People contribute to better ideas in how to make this a better product, for example.
Just give an example or 2 or 3 about what have been some of the topics of some of the prior tech meetups.
So, for example, the most recent one we had was on the government commercial cloud. We sat down, we explained what we did, what the government needs, some of the challenges we face. We had workshops with people on the ground, and we learned a lot.
Is there a website for Stackx?
Developers portal.
You go there.
You go there. All the stuff are in there. A lot of materials are in there. Recordings are in there too.
All right. So people really can learn and share through that.
Of course.
What does it take within government to support the administration of something like Stackx? Is it something where existing staff just do a little bit of extra work and do that, or does it require some full-time staff support?
It's very funny, right? People think that we need to have a crew of like tens of people to organize it. Actually, we don't. We use existing staff, actually. We've only like 2 or 3 dedicated people focusing on this area. That's it. But the key thing is that we get a lot of support from the tech companies. So when we do a Stack conference, for example, many of the presenters are very, very well-known technical people. Like in the last Stack conference in 2020, we had people like Martin Fowler, we had people like Gene Kim, people like Mitchell Hashimoto. These are really people who are at the top of their game presenting.
Yes.
And it attracts a lot of people.
Yes. And these are all people who are, in a wonderful way, geeks, technical specialists, very deeply experienced in development processes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And to be able to attract these people to present, it's not easy. But they realize how important this can be in terms of furthering the thinking about the products. And that's why they participate.
So it's very much an ecosystem.
It is an ecosystem.
Yes. It sounds to me like it's an interesting hybrid of both formal and informal.
Right.
Yes.
The tech community, in many ways, is quite informal. It's about meeting of minds. I think the best ideas come when you put a bunch of people in the room discussing things and good ideas come out. I mean, that's how it works.
Right. Now, in some governments or in some parts of a government, people will say the less said, the better. Let's not be too open. This is exactly the opposite mindset.
Yeah, the tech community became the way it is today because of sharing. I mean, if you go, I just came back from Seattle, for example. I mean, the community there is so strong, right? People meet up over lunch and they talk a whole bunch of stuff, they learn it and they go back and do something, basically. I think that kind of ecosystem is important to build. And I'm actually very glad that the Singapore government actually has the convening power for something like this. It's not easy because people do not expect that from the government. They expect that from a AWS or a Google or a Microsoft, but not from the government. But we kind of established a reputation to be able to do that. And I think that's really credit to the team's effort.
And what you're saying is it's accelerated your learning.
Of course.
As for Gov Tech as an organization.
And for many of my colleagues, right, it's also their way of getting plugged in because you cannot be unplugged from the technical community because the way we keep improving and evolving is because we are plugged in. We know what's happening next and we learn from it and we figure out what to adopt, what not to adopt.
So what you just said implies that in a somewhat informal way, it actually contributes to the professional development of your staff.
Of course it does. Big time.
Yes. So it's not the standard type of training, but it turns out to be a very important learning mechanism for your staff.
Of course, it does.
Well, that's a great example. All right. I want to ask you about another form of engagement. And this is engagement with your customers, with your users, with the population base of Singapore, be it people as individuals in their lives or be it as companies who have needs with the government. And it's easy to say, well, engage, but how do you do it? Can you give some specific examples?
Quite a few years back, our marketing and communications group started bringing together a bunch of common people. I mean, like you and me as citizens, right? To really give feedback to our products and what we do for the government.
Right, but by common people, it might not be you and me, but it might really be the everyday...
The person who uses our products,
yes,
the citizen.
The users, yes,
right.
Yes.
And we call it tech kaki. Kaki in the Singapore local parlance actually means like a bunch of friends, a bunch of community kind of stuff.
It's like an informal gathering.
Informal bunch of people. And they bring them together quite often, get their feedback, especially when we launch before we launch something new, let them try it out. And again, the feedback is just invaluable.
Well, is this like a focus group session? Is this like an ideation session?
It could be either. It could be either, depending on the sessions. But we use this group as a bunch of feedback mechanism. It also provides, they become the advocates in some ways for us. If they think that the product is really good, they become an advocate, which is just as important.
Now, one very important about this, without getting into technicalities, is the concept of sampling.
Right.
In the sense that every country has a very diverse population and many different segments of that population and many different needs. And you could get 10 people participate in a tech kaki and they'll tell you their needs, but to what extent are they representative of the population? How do you do enough of this so you have a feeling of comfort that you're really getting a feel for the spectrum of the population?
Yeah, I think the team was quite deliberate in terms of bringing the people in. But again, it's a sample, as diverse a sample as you possibly can get. And it's actually quite deliberate in terms of the kind of people we try to bring into this group of people. And the group is growing over time. So it really helps us to really test our ideas. It allows us to get very direct feedback about the things that we do, and that it really helps us improve the things we do.
So take this tech kaki, which is a type of meetup of a special sort, with a typical citizen or any type of resident of the country to get feedback, because they're the ones who use the products that different parts of the government creates for digital government. Is this something that happens once a year, once a month, once a week?
It's done both on a physical and virtual level. So again, like everything else, right, you can't bring them in every month. It's going to be quite tricky. Right. So it depends on, not necessarily in the cadence of months or weeks, etc. Depends on whether we need ideas, we are going to launch a product soon, etc. So it's really more on that. But they do connect with us virtually all the time. We send out emails, we send out flyers, EDMs, etc., and get their feedback.
Okay, and I'm just sort of curious, through what channel would you send out flyers or EDMs or requests? Through Gov Tech's distribution or through other parts of the government?
Not normally through Gov Tech distribution.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, good.
All right, because you're doing all of these other applications, you sort of have a mailing list you've built out.
Yes. And we also have a long list of followers on LinkedIn, more than 100,000.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, these people can give feedback. We post a lot on LinkedIn, for example, and to get people to feedback. Facebook, all that stuff.
It's a lot, but it's not necessarily a sample of all parts.
Sure,
because it would be a self-selecting
Sure.
set of people who would be on LinkedIn.
Sure.
Cheow Hoe, the issue of inclusion, digital inclusion, dealing with the often existing digital divide is so important. And can you explain some of the special measures you take to try and be more inclusive in how we involve all parts of the population in our digital government efforts?
You know, one of the things I realized when I joined the government is that you can't choose your customer. Very different. You know, when you're in the commercial sector, you can choose your customer. You can segment them, you can price them out of the market. You can really choose your customer because you only want to choose a base that's most profitable for you. That's what in the private sector we do. But in the government, you can't. You got to serve everyone. And I think this is really, by itself, a big challenge. So let me give you one very concrete example. Look at the COVID situation. We started with TT app, and we said, yeah, everybody has a phone and life is good. We put the app out there.
Trace together.
Trace together, right? Yes. And then we realized that that's not true because there's a bunch of people who either feel uncomfortable using the phone, don't know how to use the phone well for anything beyond messaging, for example. They're young people, they're old people. So do we leave them out? The answer is no. And that's why the team then had to come back and create a token, a simple token that they can put in their bag.
Right.
That's
so
exactly
it
the same
wasn't
thing.
a technology exercise. It was driven by the need to make sure that we made it convenient for certain segments of the population who otherwise wouldn't be included.
Exactly.
Right.
So these are important things, right? And if we don't do that, we are excluding a large population out of what we do. There are also a lot of work being done together with IMDA, our sister agency, on so-called educating different groups of people on digital. Older people, for example, funding of, for example, broadband access to the poorer people. Now, a lot of these works are going on because at the end, if you truly want to be a digital government, you really need to bring everybody in. And that is not an easy task as you go forward. The third part of this story is really about groups of people that are non-mainstream. But this is where I think many of the engineers have a very strong emotional attachment to.
A passion, a positive passion.
How do we help people, right? How do we help people that are really in need but may not have the capacity to be like one of us, to participate actively in the digital economy? So I give you one example, which I thought was very touching. A bunch of my engineers went down to an association that deals with cerebral palsy We went there and we were very touched because many of them can't move, so they have to be on a wheelchair. And the only place they articulate is their neck, actually. But many of them like to paint, which is quite amazing, right? Despite the situation they're in, they love to paint, and they paint very well. So they'll put a brush in their mouth and they will paint a scene on a canvas. But it's very difficult for them. They can't move the canvas, they can't squeeze the paint, they can't do any of these things because they're immobile. So the guys came back, they got very touched by that situation, and they created this product called eCanvas. They went out there, bought some servers, motors, small little processor, built it into the wheelchair, and through voice activation, they can actually move the canvas up and down, left and right. They can command, and they bought some soap dispenser to dispense paint, for example. So this person can then say white, the paint will drop, do this, left, the canvas moves left, and the person can paint. So now that person is independent. He or she can paint by herself.
Through voice activation.
Now, it's a very touching thing because it shows that technology can help these people. And many of my engineers are very, very proud of that because it's about purpose, right? It's about helping people through technology.
Examples where people might not have full sight or hearing, and you're giving the case they might not have full control of body motion. You might not be able to meet every need, but you're working a portfolio of efforts to help address these kinds of things.
And even like, for example, Singapore is an aging society. So there are a lot of old people who live on their own.
Yes.
And it's quite dangerous for old people to live on their own because if they fall or they are sick,
who will know?
Nobody knows, right?
Right.
So we came out with this thing called a panic button. It's just a huge red button with a battery on it. And it's connected by narrowband IoT. And we just stick it in the bedroom and the bathroom because we had done the user research that said that most old people fall in the bedroom or the bathroom.
Right.
So that if anything happens, they hit the button and it will communicate to a help center that people can respond. Now, these may be not the most rocket science things, but it helps people.
Right.
It's about inclusion.
In fact, the intelligence of the design is to make it as simple as possible.
Yes.
The minimum battery change, minimum maintenance, almost error-free usage.
Yeah, and the reason why we make the button big is because it's easier for the old people.
That's
But
right.
it also allows us to put a huge battery in it, which could last for 6 to 8 years.
All right.
Right.
All right.
And the design was quite smart because we also do a ping every few hours to make sure that the device is alive. Because, if the device is never activated, we don't know whether it's alive or dead, for example. So to design a product well takes a lot of consideration. It's not simple.
Right. So this is an example where Smart Nation is an example of how to be as simple and focused as possible.
Exactly. And you're solving problems with very basic technology.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And it comes back to your earlier statement that we had earlier in this interview on the need, the problem statement.
Exactly.
The understanding of that.
Exactly.
Cheow Hoe, in our discussion of efforts to help with inclusion, digital inclusion, you gave examples for elderly people of the panic button, right? And I want to continue on this theme. It's a fact of life, an unfortunate one, that many elder people, their memory deteriorates as they can age on. Not for all people, but for some people. And for older people whose memory is deteriorating, and is there a way to use technology to keep it so they can still participate?
Steve, you realize that in SingPass and NDI, more and more so we're going through biometrics. Because we realize that a lot of people can't remember their ID and password.
Yes.
And that's really important because what it does is that it frees a lot of people from having to remember literally like 50 passwords and IDs that they have. And also, for example, verification of things, we're using more and more biometrics. And I think that's really a technology that we found very useful, especially for older people.
Yes. So that's a good example of it's a high-tech kind of thing, but it turns out to have a very profound impact on
Exactly.
certain segments and allows them to keep participating for a longer
Correct,
period of
yes.
time.
And also, like in SingPass itself, we have captured a lot of their profiles in there so that at one glance, most of the things are in there. And this is all about making it easier for all segments of population to be able to deal with not just the government, but into the everyday living as we
Yes.
move forward.
Again, another example of your outside-in perspective,
Exactly.
but now from the outside-in focused perspective of special populations, people who have special needs,
Right.
and
Exactly.
with an eye for inclusion.
And this whole accessibility framework that is quite important to us is something we pursue quite deliberately. And we cannot take that for granted.
Where and how do you pursue it? Is it under a special group who's like user experience, or is it just something that everybody's got to think about in the way they do the design?
We have a group of people that focus on it, and they propagate their learnings across to all the design teams, actually.
We have just been speaking about digital engagement, ways of engaging the community to get ideas, right? And we've also been talking about digital inclusion. Has the 2-year experience of COVID that we've all been living through, has that given you some new ideas or new necessities for how to go about digital engagement or digital inclusion?
You know, the funny thing about COVID is that it forces a necessity. Before this happens, you find that video calls, video conference, everything was not as prevalent as today. All of a sudden, people have accepted this as a new normal. And I think it opens up quite a lot of possibilities. People in the Ministry of Health are talking a lot about telemedicine, for example, using videos, for example, to video technology to help with diagnosing of patients and patient care. In an office, I think hybrid working is going to be the thing of the future, whereby not everybody is going to be in the office. Right. So all of a sudden, the virtual and physical world is going to be more and more
hybridized.
And I think that's going to be
Yes.
something that's going to be with us for a long time to come.
And as one who has to help set the strategy for Gov Tech as well as for the government overall, what are some of the inklings of ideas that you have about how this post-COVID world will shape some of the new requirements you'll have or new things you need to be paying attention to?
So one big thrust of things that's going on right now is this thing called digital workplace. We are really focusing on how do we make the government a digital workplace for our employees also.
So what's that mean in plain English?
So in plain English, it means that how do you work virtually as much as possible? And then the reason is because if you really want everyone to be embracing digital technology, I think it starts from within. It starts from the fact that our staff themselves should be able to engage digitally, to have the best technology to be able to function in their work, and not just having a computer, it's more than that, right? A kind of a digitally enabled workforce to move us forward. So this is another big item that's coming in the horizon. Parts of it are already there. The use of Microsoft Teams, for example, is a very big thing that we do a lot with. All of a sudden, you find that you don't see many people in the office now because people are quite competent in terms of using technology to do their work and not just have to appear physically, for example. So I don't think we know the end story to this, but it's happening as we speak.
So let me ask you something that is directly resulting from what you just said. technology enablement to allow people to work from home. So we all sort of understand some of the benefits of that. Special things happen when people meet each other informally. Special things happen when people can chat above and beyond the thing that's on the specific meeting agenda. How may we use our digital enabling capabilities to also help with that kind of group building, team building, relationship building, trust building?
You know, Steve, I always believe that the hybrid approach is quite important. You cannot totally take the physical interaction out of people. Because at the end of the day, relationships are formed when people like us are talking right now. Talking right now, face-to-face versus through a telephone or computer, it's really quite different.
It is different.
We have a little bit of time right now, mainly because many of us who work in the organization have already known each other physically for a long time. So to move from a physical world to a virtual world, it's not too difficult. But for the new employees coming in, it's a big challenge.
Yes.
They have never even met many of us before, face to face, for the entire duration of their employment, for example. So I think for us going forward is the ability to mesh both of them, the virtual and the physical world, and make them as close as possible.
Right. And what you're thinking, you're envisioning through policy shaping, it will be a hybrid approach.
It's going to be a hybrid environment as we go forward.
As we wrap up, Cheow Hoe, I want to just ask one more thing. Moving on the path to digital government has many parts to it. As you've discussed through so many examples, this is not simple. How would you summarize the key building blocks and the key assets for other countries who want to learn from Singapore's experience to date about national digital enablement strategies, transformation strategies? What are the most convenient things for people to look at or to pay attention to?
You know, the funny thing is that it comes back to people. Getting the right people to do the job is very, very important, right? Because all the building blocks will keep changing. That's life. But once you get the right people who understands how to put it together, it makes a big difference. Right. And I'm actually very thankful for the team that we have because we managed to get some really very good people who are able to keep evolving and moving with times, moving with technology, moving with policy changes, moving with circumstances like COVID, etc. And I think they all made a difference. Because there's no one single building block there that's more important than the other. They are all quite important. The national digital identity is very important. Building the cloud and tech stack is very important. The policy dimension is important. All these are just very important.
Right.
But it's getting the right people in all these areas that's able to put it together into a holistic approach.
And obviously, there's a policy decision to have the organizations that pull these people together.
And I keep reiterating back to two fundamental points, right? Which is knowing the problem you're trying to solve. I think that's so important. This is nothing about technology. It's about solving problem in an innovative way using digital technology. And the second thing is learning how to start small. You know, you can't boil the ocean. It's just too difficult.
Yes, but implied in learning how to start small is learning how to start small and having a sense of what happens next, next. Because as I've been told by numerous government officials over the years, if you put enough effort to it, any pilot can be made to succeed, but most pilots cannot scale.
Yep.
So this sort of duality of knowing how to start small, but knowing how to think ahead of what it takes to scale.
So Steve, I mean, to wrap up, the best thing that I can say is that start small, think big, and act really fast.
Yes. Cheow Hoe, I would like to convey the most sincere thank you for setting aside such a substantial amount of your time, especially given all the things that you have to do, specifically for this experience sharing specifically for this United Nations request so that so much of the experience of GovTech can be made available to others through this video. A most sincere and gracious thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I think it was well worth the effort. Thank you.